law.
As we don't use all my high school. Really should have.
What's that?
All of my high school teachers all thought that I could go inside.
It's something that is still pervasive today. It hasn't ended. It hasn't ended. People believed again that people of color, like black people or whatever, that there was no way that they were savages. That there was no way that they could possibly have the mental capacity that a Caucasian person could. And people believed this. It wasn't an idea, it was a belief. So the next ones that I've talked about here is just, again, the idea of fin de siècle and some of the cartoons that would actually make fun of society. Which happened. And again, guys, if you want to take off anytime, I'm not going to begrudge anybody to take off if they want to or have to, really. And then, so that's this. So what I'm going to do actually is, for right now, I'm not going to give you. If you want, you can read through the rest of this at the beginning of class on Tuesday. What I'm going to do is, we're going to go through some of these things together because there's other things that I have to explain, like, for example, in the illustration where it says punch or the London shibari. The shibari is a really important part of culture at this time, so I want to explain what the shibari is because this is...
Is it chivalry?
No, shibari. It's on this page.
Ah, yeah, shibari.
French. Shibari. And you go ahead, really, truly. Yeah, so just basically, first two chapters, please. Fine, Melanie. So yeah, I want to explain what the shibari is because this was, it started out something, but then it became a way to humiliate women in public. So I wanted to talk about that. If you want, you can read the Napoleonic Code, but I'm going to go through it in class together. It basically talks about how men and women were, yeah, basically how women were treated as opposed to men. And again, this was law in Louisiana. Then there's some more information on the historical cultural background and Chopin's controversial views, which I do want you to end up reading, please. Please also before Tuesday, if you can, please read historical and cultural background and controversial views, because we're going to be talking a little bit about that at the beginning of class on Tuesday. Then I will go through some of the other stuff. Your whole reading assignment. So you can see in the handout the annotations. I've divided up. Hi, Tatiana. I've divided up your reading assignments. So the first part is going to be from chapters 1 to 13.
And the additional quotation.
Yeah, where it says additional annotations, chapters 1 through 13. And I'm using Roman numerals because she does. Chopin uses Roman numerals for her chapters in the novel. But this just kind of gives you some information if you run across something in the chapters, you're like, oh, what does that mean? Yeah. I may have tried to give it an explanation here. But for Thursday, that will ultimately be your whole reading is up to chapter 13. But for Tuesday, until chapters just 1 and 2, that we're going to go through in depth. I'm so sorry, guys, for going so over time. I would, if anybody, again, if you want to go, you can. If anybody wants to quickly stay and just see information about the characters, you can. If not, I totally understand if you just want to take off. You can maybe look up some information. Does anybody want to see it? Because I will stay and show it to you quickly. Yeah. Okay, no problem. But I have if you want to leave, sincerely, guys, feel free. I have no ill feelings about people needing to leave. I'm already very, very grateful that you stayed this long. I'm so sorry.
Our choice.
Bye, guys. Have a great day. Have a good weekend. Enjoy the Monday holiday.
Where are you? You're not even in it.
I'm just looking at the
guys. So I just want to give you so this is information just quickly about the story itself. So again, the awakening. So the major cast of characters you're going to encounter is first the protagonist, or antagonist, depending on your point of view. But the main character is a woman named Edna, and the pronunciation is Pontillier. It's French. Pontillier, yes. So Edna Pontillier. Edna is the protagonist of the novel, and the awakening to which the title refers is hers. The character experiences an awakening. She's 28, and she is the wife of a New Orleans businessman. Edna suddenly finds herself dissatisfied with her marriage and the limited conservative lifestyle that it allows. You can see already, not good. So, Léonce, his name is Léonce Pontillier, is her husband. Léonce is 40. Now, 28 to 40 is not an unusual thing at this time. That age difference is really not a big deal. Men would often wait sometimes until they had more wealth so that they could get a better wife.
Better wife?
Yeah, like a higher class of wife. Yeah, always in quotation marks. Always in quotation marks. So if he were rich and he wanted to basically get somebody from a wealthy family as well, he might need some time to establish his wealth a little bit longer or whatever. But that's, again, the age difference. And of course, again, remember, everything is on purpose. So Chopin makes a conscious choice to make Léonce 40 and Edna 28. Okay? But it's not a strange thing for that age difference, but it is a choice that she makes, as in Chopin. Next, there is Robert Lebrun. Robert Lebrun is 26, and he is a single man with whom, sorry, I know here's some spoilers, but you have to know this, with whom Edna falls in love. Dramatic and passionate, he has a history of becoming the devoted attendant to a different woman each summer at Grand Isle. So, the novel takes place in various places, which I'm going to talk about in just a second. The opening part of the novel takes place at a place called Grand Isle. It is kind of the home of a very wealthy widow who has children. So she's wealthy, she has children, so there's not that, and she's older. So there's not that pressure to remarry because she's older, she's wealthy, she has children, sons, especially, so she's golden, basically. She owns a kind of, I don't want to say plantation, because that has a different kind of connotation these days, but it has like a big house and smaller little cottages and stuff like on the property. And every summer, the wealthy people from New Orleans, they leave the hot, humid city and go to this island where the temperatures are cooler, because it's an island, there's like breezes and stuff like that. So this is where the wealthy summer. That's actually a verb, to summer. So a lot of wealthy people would summer on these islands. So Robert Lebrun, and when it says that he is the devoted attendant to a different woman, this was also quite common at the time. They would have kind of the younger guys, very often the sons of the kind of matriarchs of the plantation, the homestead, whatever. And again, because in Creole culture, women's chastity is never, ever, ever, ever questioned. And husbands frequently just did not have much to do with their wives. They were off with the other men, doing other things, or maybe having affairs or whatever. And so these young guys would kind of be the flatterers for some of the women. They'd be the ones to kind of entertain them. There was no sex. So that was understood to be, no, that just would not happen. Not necessarily because of the men, but because of the women. Which is, again, I can't emphasize enough. It was just unheard of that a woman would even contemplate having an affair in Creole culture. So then you can also see the fact that Edna falling in love with Robert, Chopin obviously makes them closer in age. So perhaps similar, whatever. Next, we have Adele. Adele, her last name is pronounced Ratignolle. Ratignolle. You can just call her Adele. That's good. So Edna's close friend, Adele, represents the Victorian feminine ideal. She idolizes her children and worships her husband, centering her life around caring for them and performing her domestic duties. In the novel, she is portrayed almost like a Victorian goddess. She's beautiful, she's perfect. She worships her children, her husband. She's just like, if men were reading The Awakening at that time, they'd probably be thinking, man, I want Adele. Because she was the one. Then we have a character called Mademoiselle Reese. Madame Reese is probably the most influential character in Edna's Awakening. She is unmarried and childless, which is very interesting, but she's wealthy. So she kind of gets away with it, but she's still a spinster. She's still eccentric. People kind of look at her or just kind of tolerate her in some ways because she's kind of grouchy and crotchety and things like that. She's older. But she devotes her life to her passion, which is music. A talented pianist and somewhat of a recluse, she represents independence and freedom and serves as a sort of muse for Edna. Then we have Alsace Arobin. He is the seductive, charming, and forthright character who is the man who will sleep with the married women and then brags about his conquests. He is kind of like the Don Juan, the playboy. And Arobin, again, enjoys making conquests out of married women. So if you associate with Alsace Arobin, there is talk, shall we say. Next, some of the major motifs and symbols that I want you to look for. So especially when you're reading the first couple chapters, and for your reading assignment, guys, pay very, very, very close attention to chapter 6 and chapter 10. Chapter 6 and chapter 10 are very significant chapters in the first part of the novel. And some of the things that I want you to look out for are what Chopin, whenever she mentions eyes, she does a lot with talking about eyes. And of course, there's the old saying, the eyes are the windows to a person's soul. So there's that aspect. Keep in mind the whole concept of, you might notice that on the cover of your addendum, I've put a cage and a bird. That's not random. In The Awakening, Chopin uses birds and cages very symbolically. Birds are pretty,
But they're caged.
but better caged. The water and the sea. Keeping in mind, of course, water has a lot. Water has a lot of symbolism. Water is a symbol of rebirth. Water is the symbol of life. Water is the symbol of lots of things. So she talks a lot about water and the sea. The idea of children and what children represent in the novel also becomes quite controversial. There's really not much that isn't controversial in The Awakening. The idea of houses. This is not going to make much sense now, but basically throughout the novel, there are 3 houses that are involved. And they almost serve as, like in a play, you might have Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. These houses almost serve as symbols of the different acts. in Edna's life. So that will become clearer as we move through the novel. The use of language. Now, by that, I don't mean just the obvious symbolism that she's using in language, but she actually uses language very purposefully. Now, Edna is not Creole. Edna marries into a Creole family. Her husband is Creole. Edna comes from Kentucky. So she's still a Southern belle. So there's that. So that still makes her acceptable. She's not from the North or, anything like that. But she's a foreigner still in some ways. So she's married Leonce. Leonce is very wealthy. He's a very popular businessman. He's very popular among the women at Grand Isle. They think that he's the perfect husband, blah, 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 blah. But there are instances where Chopin, who was fluent in French herself, uses language as a means of isolation. So there are some times when characters will be speaking French, which I have given you translations and given you definitions of French terms and stuff like that here. But look at the instances when Chopin is doing that. Is she doing that because in that instance it's a way to isolate Edna? And then sometimes Edna speaks French, but it's kind of like pidgin French. Like you have, it's kind of a poor man's French. She's trying, but it's just very basic French. She's not, by no means is she fluent. But language also becomes very representational as in voice. Because in the beginning, people are speaking the same language, as in they're talking about the same things. They believe the same things. But over the course of the novel, Edna's language is going to change. As in she's going to start talking about things that people don't understand. And I don't mean as in they don't understand the words, they don't understand the meanings. Why are you saying this? This is so scandalous for you to say something like that. So Edna kind of develops her own language over the course of the novel. And I don't mean a foreign language, but I do mean a foreign language. Because it really is foreign to the people around her because they can't understand why she's suddenly talking about all of these things that women just don't talk about. You don't talk about these things. So keep that in mind too about how language plays a part of the novel. The idea of solitude versus solitary, they're not the same things. And they're represented differently in the novel. Of course, sexuality. Basically, women were given none. And sex was never, ever talked about. Actual sex was never mentioned in literature, even hinted at. No.
But it's called porno.
Yes, and again, spoilers because there's sex in The Awakening. But no description, no overt description that we might think of today. So it's to the point where I will actually tell you guys, okay, it's here, because you might not actually recognize what's happening. So I'm going to actually say, it happens here, oh, it happens here, because but to an audience at that time, they knew what was going on. And it was very, very scandalous. So the idea of sexuality, and basically that women just weren't allowed sexuality at all, not only in fiction, but in real life. The idea of women's sexuality or anything like that was non-existent. And then finally, the concept of freedom, which I have included in quotation marks, because again, freedom according to whom? So guys, again, pay special attention to chapter 6, but also chapter 10, because the themes and language used foreshadow and encapsulate much of what we will be discussing throughout the novel. So chapter 6 and 10, just read those a couple of times. Plus, chapter 6 is very short, but in my opinion, chapter 6 is one of the most beautifully written chapters of all time. the language, for me, sorry, and then this is very like reader response criticism, I'm very much like influencing, I don't mean to influence you, but for me, the language in chapter 6 is just, so pay really close attention to chapter 6 and to what happens in chapter 10. And the end.